Hello and welcome to today's web conference. This is Dynamics 365 Fast Track Tech Talk. Today's topic, solution development. Presenting for us today from Microsoft, we have Senior Fast Track Program Manager, Chris Knowles. So without any further delay, Chris, over to you.
Thank you, Janice, and hello, everyone. Thank you for joining today. As Janice said, my name is Chris Knowles, and I have been with Microsoft for a little over 5 years, all of that time spent in the Dynamics space, focused on CRM. And today we will be talking about solution development. What we'd like to be able to talk about today is customizations, extensions. We'll talk some about best practices, and then I'll give you some information about resources, and of course we will do question and answer. We should run somewhere today in the time frame of 1 to 2 hours, and we're hoping that as we complete today's session, you'll have a good sense of how to perform customizations in Dynamics 365 using the out-of-the-box features, that you'll have a good understanding of how to begin to develop plugins, integrations, leverage JavaScript for customization, and then create custom actions for Dynamics 365. We'll also review the best practices when you are looking at developing solutions and developing for Dynamics 365. So for customizations, some things that are important with this are understanding how to manage and deploy customizations, customizing entities, and that means adding fields and relationships within the platform, building forms for user to input and retrieve data, implementing business rules, presenting information in views, and then, of course, exporting and importing. So what is a solution? A solution is a container for customization. And this means basically it's a package that keeps entities, fields, web resources, and other things that are all part of the customizations for your particular implementation. A solution is not required. We do have what we call the default solution, which is just a large open solution, but it doesn't necessarily organize and keep things kind of containerized for you. So solutions do help when you actually want to begin to create certain aspects of what will be in your implementation. The default solution, as I mentioned, contains all of the system components, as well as other out-of-the-box things, and then potentially anything that you put in as customization. You do have the ability to export a solution from your Dynamics instance as either managed or unmanaged. And if you'd like more information on that, we covered that in much more detail in our application lifecycle management TechTalk. But you should really invest some time in understanding the two different types of solutions and how you would like to use them depending on the development model that you choose to implement. So when you look at solutions and you want to understand what they are, one of the things that's really important in dealing with solutions is understanding that all solutions are tied to a publisher. These are critically important because this helps you identify who is responsible for putting these changes into the system. You can create a version number. You can put up the 4 numbers separated by decimals. And then, of course, you want to use that as kind of a tracking between like major and minor versions like you would typically have when you develop software. You want to make sure that you understand when you're creating a solution that once you've created that, you can't go back and change those base values. You would have to either update the solution by creating a copy of the solution and then changing the version number, or potentially creating a new solution that you would then put on top of the solution that you're developing. What's in a solution? So there are a lot of different components that go into the solution. So pretty much everything that's containerized within your Dynamics implementation for a given instance is one of these types of components. So within that, we have the schema, which represents the data, if you will, which are encapsulated as entities, fields within entities, relationships, and option sets. Then we also have templates, email templates, contract templates, article templates, mail merge templates as well. On the user interface, we provide forms, views, charts, dashboards, the sitemap, ribbons, command ribbons for your different forms, and then of course your apps that go in there as well. And then whether you have custom processes or custom code, things like assemblies that relate to creating plugins or workflows or dialogues or business process flows. Any number of these things that you see here on the right side And then lastly, in kind of a general category, you have security roles, field security profiles, connection roles, which kind of identify what type of entity you're connecting to, like a contact could be a salesperson, or it could be an employee, or it could be a stakeholder for a project, as an example. Reports, system settings, and then you have your SLA for, of course, your support case. So, what is entity customization? Within the world of Dynamics, an entity is basically a type of record. System entities, for example, are account, case, article, business unit, contact, project, all of those types of things. And they basically represent, if you will, a table in a database. It's a little more complicated than that in the actual underlying, but you can think of it that way. And then within the entity, you have records. So each record that is stored within that entity can represent an account or a contact or a case, and it will allow you to store and maintain that information. And then, of course, related to that entity is metadata that describes the entity and how the information in the entity is presented to a user. And then, of course, within a record, you have a field. We also reference them as attributes, and you can think of them as a column in a database table, or column in the entity table, as we refer to it. So what is a form? A form is a visualization of a single record. Pretty standard thing. It just translates the same across all software development. But a form basically has the ability to take the information that is in a single record of an entity and display it and allow that form to interact with the user, so that they can add information into a form, they can update information on a form. Of course, they can use that form to make modifications, or potentially have other information that's related to that information, which we call subgrids. You have the ability to do all of these things in a way that presents information to your users in the most efficient way possible. And then lastly, a view. And what a view allows you to do is to display a list of records from an entity. So, for example, a list of contacts. And then you have the ability also to filter the information that's on a view, and you can control what columns are presented within the view as well. So with entities, we also have system entities, and a lot of our system entities are built-in entities that are created as part of the deployment. Some can be modified, some cannot. You can go and look at the information on that particular entity to tell you whether or not it can actually be changed. If it cannot be changed, then it will tell you that, and it will also tell you that it cannot be locked down or managed by a separate managed solution. And then, of course, you have the ability to create your own custom entities. These can be created within the tool, or they can be created as part of a solution import. But these are where you may need information that is related to other information that you have in the system that's not represented by one of the entities that is provided out of the box. So when you go to create an entity within the tool, you actually have to provide certain pieces of information that will then allow the system to create a representation of that entity so that you can begin to store information in it, including things like the entity name, the entity display name. So when we reference the entity within our views and within dashboards and within other presentations, you can say this would be, for example, maybe you're keeping track of a list of vehicles that are available to salespeople, just as an example, making something up. And so there's not an entity within Dynamics that represents that out of the box, so you would create a new entity. So when you do that, you would give the new entity a name, like salesperson vehicles, and then you would say, how is that entity going to be represented to users? And that's called the display name. And then, of course, we also give you the option to add a plural for that as well. And when you see the navigation of views, that's what will be represented. You can define if there's a specific image related to that entity or a color. virtual entity, which means that it can be set up to be related to an external API where it can go and retrieve information dynamically, or whether it's actually contained within the Dynamics instance. Who owns the entity and how it's owned. Then, of course, activity settings, so whether or not there are activities that can be associated with it, and then, of course, the description of these. Other things that can be set on the entity as well within these checkboxes, or whether it's available for communication and collaboration, data services, whether it's available within Outlook or mobile, and then, of course, what processes are associated with that particular entity. Once you've gone through and you've created customizations, what you then have to do is publish them. And basically, publication is the act of taking that entity information or the information that you've created as customization and then actually applying it to be broadly available within your Dynamics instance. There's a number of ways to accomplish this, but when you go and you do this, so for example, if you go in, you create a new entity, you may create some other things around that entity, you may create attributes for that entity, and then, of course, a form, and you're going to want to publish that so that your users can then see it. Once you publish it, everything becomes visible out within the actual implementation that you have. And once you do that, everything goes published all at once. So everything that you have in its customizations, when you click publish, you can click publish all customizations, and it will publish all of them. You have to make sure that once you make changes, you do publish those changes, because otherwise it can have an impact if you choose not to do that. But once you do that, you can kind of take it from a mindset of saying, okay, I now have this group of changes I'm ready to publish out to my community. Now, this could just be in a development instance, for example, where you're working on something as a developer and you have all of this stuff that you've worked on, and now you're ready to put it out there so that it's part of the broader solution that is in your development. And then that would become part of the solution that's taken out and then migrated to your QA instance, for example. So you have to make sure, too, that when you publish customizations and you want them to appear in tablets or in mobile, you want to make sure that you always publish them, and that you make sure that every time that happens, those are synchronized with the Dynamics 365 for Tablets application. One thing you do have to understand related to publishing customizations is you don't want to publish customizations within a system whenever there is normal system functionality going on, because it's a rather intensive process for taking those customizations and then putting them out so that they're ready to be used. The thing that you need to consider in publishing customizations, especially in a production environment, is that you want to schedule those in off-hours times. And if you're in a 24/7 environment, we recommend that you schedule those publication windows as you would normally schedule maintenance windows or planned outage windows, et cetera, as part of your implementation. So, what are fields? Pretty much, if you're familiar with the concept of columns in a database, columns in a table related to a database, basically that's what a field is. A field is a single piece of information related to that entity. And when you go and you create the field, it actually allows you to define the type of a field. It will show up as a control on a form. It would be used as a display column in a view. It can be used as part of a query. And then basically it translates to a column that's related to that entity in a SQL database. We also refer to them as attributes, as I mentioned before. What types of fields are available? So when you look at the types of fields that you can create within Dynamics for a particular entity, there are a number of different types of fields you can create. You have the ability to create what we call a customer field, which relates to a customer record that could point to either an account or a contact record. That's very handy, for example, in an opportunity where you may not have an actual customer yet, but you do have someone who would represent the customer, and that would be a contact versus an account. You have the ability to determine whether it's an account or a contact when you go onto the form and you add it. A multi-select option set. So this is where you may have a list of values that you want to provide your user as options on a particular field. So, for example, maybe a type of customer, as an example, and you would have 3 or 4 or 5 different types, and maybe you have one type that's available that you want them to select, or you could have multiple types that you want them to select, and you can actually present this in a multi-select option set. A single line of text, this basically translates to an invar chart. If you see here, we represent the actual SQL data type that's used underneath the covers for these particular field types. But the idea here is that, for example, if you just want to have them enter a short note or something, a quick description of something, then you could use what we call single line of text. It contains up to 4,000 characters, and it's very powerful for just containing bits of unstructured information. An option set. This is similar to the multi-select option set, except that there's only one option available to select. And basically, you would create the list of values, you can order them, you can assign them an internal value for representation and ordering, and then, of course, when that is presented on the form, it will show up as a drop-down, and then they can pick a value from that, and that's the value that they put in the field. A two-option select is basically a yes, no, or a true, false. It's basically an option set with just yes and no. It does have some specific identifiers, and as you can see, it is stored slightly differently. But ultimately, it's designed to be just atomic and either on or off with how it's represented. You can create whole numbers, floating point numbers, decimal numbers, as well as numbers that represent currency specifically. You can also create multiple lines of text fields. So, for example, a long description of an account, or potentially a brief notes field on an opportunity versus using what we call an affinity, a date time field, which can store the date and the time, and then, of course, a lookup, which will represent potentially a GUID value that could point to another entity that has a relationship to the entity that you're currently dealing with. In terms of field creation, basically when you go to create a new field, you would go to the entity, you could then pull that entity up, and then you would have the list of fields, and then you could then tell it to add a field at that point. That allows you to enter in specific information about that field and how that field is handled and managed and how it's represented. And then, of course, what you can do as part of versioning is be able to track notes for that particular field and information. You can also create the information related to it if it's an option set, or other controlling information depending on what type of fields you're choosing to create. So when you create option sets, multi-select option sets, and two option fields, it will store the numeric value that relates to that particular type of option set, but it will be represented as a label. They are stored as integers. When you do a multi-select, it basically stores an integer array. You would not want to use, just for the sake of performance, I wouldn't recommend on a multi-option select going above the 150 options that you could select, but certainly, you want to manage that, but you can put a significant number of options in there, and then you just want to balance whether or not it makes sense that that's an option, it's an option set, or whether it actually translates to a lookup in another entity. And then the two options, of course, is stored as a bit field, and typically it's represented as yes or no. You can also configure a default value, so when it pops up on the form, it can have a value of not assigned, or it can have an optional default value. You cannot create a default value for a multi-select because, of course, that's kind of contrary to the purpose of it being a multi-select option set. And then, of course, you have to select the value for the two options select. It cannot be a null. It has to be either 0 or 1. You can also define minimum and maximum values. So, for example, if you are adding a numeric field in, and there is a range of values in which it can set, you can actually define those, and then the system will throw an error if someone enters a value that's outside of that range. Another thing that's important to know on numeric fields is the precision. So, of course, on whole numbers, there's not a precision that's applicable. For floating point, you can have up to 5 decimal places. For a decimal field, up to 10. And then for currency, we typically represent that up to 4 decimal places. And then you can specify that through the currency precision. So displaying information when you are displaying call numbers, for example, if you choose not to format it, then it's just displayed as the integer number. If it represents something like a duration, then you can choose. For example, this could be like for a follow-up. It could represent minutes, hours, or days. A lot of times, if you're going to schedule a follow-up appointment with someone, you can use that duration as well. Or, for example, if you're scheduling a meeting and the duration of the meeting itself, you could use that, represented that way as well. For time zone, basically you can choose from a pick list as to what time zone you want to be used when it's represented. And then, of course, language. You have the ability to install languages on your Dynamics instance, and then, of course, you can choose how that language is represented for that particular, how that number format is represented for that particular field. So when you deal with dates and times, it's always stored as a date time, which is the date and time together. You can display it as a date and time or a date only. Internally within the system, all date times are stored in UTC. Each user has the ability to select what their local time zone is, and then, of course, it will be translated to that user's local time zone and whatever the preferred display format is represented based on how they would like that date time displayed. Depending on what part of the world you're in, it can be displayed in a number of different ways. It does convert to the local time zone, even if it's only a date field. So it's just something to consider. And then, of course, you have to make sure that when you're dealing with date fields, you want to take into consideration that there could be variations in the date depending on how you're looking at it as you are represented to a local time zone. So 8 o'clock here in the afternoon, in the evening is the 12 a.m. of the next day in London, and of course reversing on forward throughout the rest of Europe. So lookup fields. This is one way that you can actually create kind of a simple relationship from an entity perspective. This holds a value that points to another entity. So, for example, on an opportunity, you may have a primary contact as an example, and this would be a lookup field. The primary contact field on the opportunity would point to the contact entity, and then what gets stored within that field in the actual database is what we call a GUID, which GUID is always our global unique identifier that we use to represent as a primary key value for all of our entities. And then, of course, they don't see the GUID. What you would see is the primary field of whatever record is linked. So, as we mentioned here, if you were bringing in a contact, it would be the contact full name that gets displayed as the primary field, and you would identify that, of course, when you create the entity and create the field as the primary field. Lookups are always associated with one-to-many relationships, so you would create a relationship potentially between opportunity and contact if one did already exist for you, which it does. But if you were creating a custom entity, for example, you would just create a one-to-many relationship, and then you could add that lookup field on the form and have that represented. The customer field is a special lookup field that has the ability to point, as I mentioned before, to either an account or a contact record. So properties of fields. When you define fields within an entity, you have the ability to define how they are required. If they are optional, that means there is absolutely no driving force to compel people to enter that information. If they are business recommended, then it is marked in a way that shows that, to get their attention, that this is something you should enter. You don't have to enter it, but you should. Business required means that when the form comes up, that field is on it. That field has to be entered before the form will either be updated or created. But it is enforced only on forms and built within the form management logic. You would have to enforce it elsewhere yourself. And then, of course, the requirement level can be modified either by business rules or it can be modified on client-side JavaScript within the form engine. It is searchable. The properties of fields are searchable. You also have the ability to define field level security. which gives you the ability to create a profile that says for certain types of users with certain security roles, you can or cannot see this field, you can or cannot modify this field. You also have the ability to define auditing on that particular field, and then you can provide a description that describes what that field actually is. So form types. As we've talked about forms are the way that we visually represent access to an entity via a record at a time format. So when you look at the different types of forms, you have what we call the main form, and this is the form that's used by the browser. It can also be used by our Outlook client. And then, of course, when you're running the Dynamics 365 for tablets, you can also use that main form as well. But it is responsive and does translate to the mobile platform. You can also create a quick create form. So one of the features that we have in Dynamics is the ability to do a quick create, where you can click on the plus up at the top of your page, and that will bring up a quick create form that will then let you choose what entity you want to create. You can go and create it and just enter in some basic information. A lot of times that's handy within a work process. So if a salesperson's on the phone and they're dealing with something and something else comes in, they need to make a quick note, maybe they want to add a contact, or maybe they're working on something and somebody calls and they want to add themselves a follow-up, they can do that, or they can go and create a contact really quickly, or something else that may translate to what they need to then go back to follow up on later. That quick create form is also available, and it can be customized to an extent. Then a quick view form is basically just a form that you can use to place within another form that can represent parent or related record information within a form of a different entity. And then lastly, a card form, which is used to present data primarily in interactive dashboards. So how is the form structured? Forms are basically structured and having a header with some basic important information for kind of the overall context of that particular form. You also have the ability to put fields within a footer, although the fields in the footer are read-only. Within the body of the form, it's usually broken up into tabs, and those tabs can be either open or closed. And then within those tabs, you have sections, and then you can also create within the section, you can create columns containing information. So you have a lot of flexibility in how you can create forms and how you can then manage those forms to present information. Within a section on a form, you have the ability to create additional fields. You can have what we call subgrids. You can also add charts. You can have what we have called the notes control, which has additional information. You can also use our social pane. Our timeline control now with V9 that allows you to then represent different types of information within the single control. You can put iframes in, web resources, theme maps, and you have lots of other things that you can do. One of the things that I've talked about is we've been talking today is subgrid. So a subgrid is basically a way for the displaying related data. So, for example, I'm a salesperson, and I have a customer that I deal with, and when I look at that customer's information, I want to see all of the opportunities that I have for that customer. So that would be represented using a subgrid. So on the form for what we call the account, when the salesperson goes in and they pull that account up, somewhere on the form within a section would be a subgrid that is then associated to the opportunity entity, and it can bring in the related records that are tied to that account that are opportunities. They can be unrelated. Typically, it's easier to do it when there's a relationship between the two entities, but you can bring in unrelated fields. It does require some customization, but certainly that is something that you can do. Normally, you select a view to use to display the information and filter the information within that subgrid. And then, of course, the users can then go and interact with that subgrid, and they can open up the record for a particular entity within that subgrid, and everything else works the same like any other view. So on the form designer, when you go and you interact with the form designer to create forms within Dynamics 365, this is typically what you will see. What's represented here is the account form. Normally, when you are dealing with forms in Dynamics, especially for the base entities like account and contact and case or incident, you will see kind of the out of the box. You can create a new one. You can copy. You can take one like this and save it as a copy and then make changes to it. We typically recommend that you leave the default forms. You can disable them if you don't want to have them available to your users, but make a copy of the default form so that you have it, and then you can go in and make changes to a copy, and that will allow you to then go and make whatever you want to do, but you can always have a fallback just in case something happens. As you can see, there are fields available on the form. You can also pick and choose from the list of fields in that particular entity to add to the form. You have a lot of flexibility and control in terms of whether you're displaying a view or a subgrid, as well as the other types of information that you can display within a form. So another thing that we've talked about is relationships. Normally, relationships are representative of a relationship between two different types of entities. This is very similar to a relational model within a database. You can have a one-to-many, or a many-to-one, or even a many-to-many. There are system relationships that come predefined within the system between entities as part of the out-of-the-box system, but you also have the ability to create your own relationships. A lot of times this is handy if you are creating custom entities that store related information to primary entities, or if you have two custom entities that you want to relate to each other, you can do that as well. And then, for example, normally they are self-referencing. So, for example, if you have a case and then that case has cases underneath it, the reference will automatically associate when you create the relationship between those two. So one-to-many relationships, as I mentioned before, typically this is something where you want to have it related as a primary piece of information and then secondary information that is related to that primary piece of information. For example, here it shows a one-to-many between account and projects. I have used the example of opportunity. But you have the ability when you go in and you look at the primary account within the Solution Explorer in Dynamics, which is where you do all of your customization activity, it would show as a one-to-many relationship, something that's very handy in terms of being able to understand what's available there. When you go into create a relationship, you would basically go into the type of relationship that you want to create, and you see those in the left-hand pane when you're actually on the entity. You can go and select the one-to-many relationships, and it will show you existing one-to-many relationships. You can then click on New and add a new relationship, and it actually takes the primary entity that you're on and then asks you for the related entity, and then you can describe the relationship, and then you can also create the behavior of that relationship and how it chooses to relate. And as you can see here, basically it's aligning. When you go to create this, it actually creates it in a way that makes it clear that this is a relationship between two separate entities. You can define whether or not it's searchable. You can define whether or not it's hierarchical. Now, the one thing to consider with hierarchical is that normally that's a relationship to itself versus a relationship to another entity. You can then define the lookup field. So what field drives basically the foreign key relationship between the sub-entity or the entity that's being displayed as a related entity, and then how that relates back to the primary entity. Additionally, when you create a one-to-many relationship, you can also create rules that define how that sub-information exists and persists based on what happens to the parent record. So when things happen, for example, to an account, if you want the related information to that account to also follow what happens through the account itself, you can define that through this type of relationship. So which records it actually applies to, what happens, for example, if a record gets orphaned, where I have a project that was related to an account, It's no longer related to an account. You can define whether or not those projects would get deleted when the account gets deleted, for example. And then you also have the ability to reparent, and that puts a new owner in for all of those relations. The types of actions that can trigger what we call the cascading behavior, an assign. So, for example, when you have a primary entity in the relationship that's assigned to another user, all of the subsequent records that are assigned there can be assigned to that user as well. When it is shared, you can also control the sharing, or if it's unshared, same again, the cascading behavior. If it's reparented, where the parent record changes, it can also recreate that association. When you do a merge between two entities, the entity that comes out of that merge process, what happens with those records that are related between the two, they're brought together. And then, of course, what happens when a record is deleted? If you delete it, you can say delete all of the related records, and everything that's associated with that primary record would be as well. So again, managing the rules for doing this cascading operation, you can tell it to cascade all. So ultimately, that would say do it on all related records. You can tell it to cascade active. So basically, on any records that are active versus records that are historical, cascade user owned. So if that sub-record is owned by the same user, then of course that means that it's going to behave in a way where that relationship is driven by the same owner, how that behavior is driven as well when the cascade happens. And then of course, cascade done means don't do anything to any of the sub-records. Anything, when you do these assignments, anything but a done makes the relationship between the two entities what we call a parental relationship. And then, of course, when you do a delete, you have the ability, again, to find the type of delete. If you do a cascade all, then all related records are deleted. If you say remove link, basically that breaks the association between those two records. Of course, then on restrict delete, you would really just try to delete the actual one record. But it does prevent, if a sub-record is deleted, it prevents the primary record, of course, from being deleted if there are sub-records there where they're related. So we talked about the parental relationship just a minute ago. So what does that really mean? Basically, in a parental relationship, all rules apply. Cascade all is the normal behavior that happens there. If it's referential, there are some basic rules that apply, but it does not cascade. And when it's deleted, it does not delete the related record. It simply removes the link. For example, if you do a referential with a restrict delete, of course, then that controls how that behavior is managed as well. And then lastly, you can set it up to be configurable cascading, and then you can determine how you want that behavior to actually apply in a given condition. This is critically important to understand as you create entities and create relationships, because you want to make sure that all of that related information is being managed appropriately. So just make sure that as you're doing this, that you get a good sense of these rules and how they apply and how you want them to apply for different types of data. So business rules. Business rules are what we have in place within a form to drive the behavior on a form, or if you would think about it this way, is the ability that we have to kind of encapsulate a workflow. Now, not the technical workflow, but the actual user's workflow as they go through their process. So, for example, what's the process when a user is working an opportunity? You can use business rules to drive this. You could also use business rules to drive your lead to opportunity close or your lead to tax process. Business rules can be leveraged in this manner, and they're driven off of forms. So when you create business rules, they are related to an entity, and of course, you apply them to all the forms within the client. And all the clients also display those rules. You can set the scope of the rule to one form or all forms, depending on how you want it to behave when the client interacts with it. And then, of course, on the form, the business rules are triggered when a record is opened or when a record is changed, and it triggers one of the rule conditions. Any business rule could potentially be triggered once a particular condition is met, whether or not the form is actually open. And that's handy because if you have a process that's going to drive an information flow, you may not have somebody on that particular record at that time, but the things behind the business rule would still invoke and can still invoke actions based on that condition and the rule being met. When you define conditions for a business rule, you want to make sure that you understand when you're creating conditions, how those conditions behave. And then, of course, you want to make sure that you're testing. Typically, it's driven by testing a field value, whether something contains data or not, whether it equals or does not equal. You have the ability to do this, and then you also have the ability to compare to another field of the same type or a particular value, or potentially even a mathematical formula or a date time. When you create business rules, you always start with a condition. Based on that particular condition, there could be one or more actions that are created to take place based on that condition. And so, by creating a combination of conditions and actions, you can pretty much do anything on a form or within the context of a business rule or within a business process. And for example, you can set field values, you can clear field values, you can show or hide fields, you can set field requirement levels. For example, something may be business recommended, but when a particular condition happens, you may change that to business required. You can validate data and show error messages. And then, of course, you can create business recommendations based on business intelligence that's associated to the form. So here's what the business rule creator looks like within the platform. When you actually go to the form, you click on the business rules. This is what will come up, and then you actually have the ability to drive how the business rule is created. And then you can add new conditions. You basically drag and drop. You can actually drag actions underneath the condition. You can define whether or not it is the positive or negative test of that condition, what actions happen accordingly. You can also chain conditions together so that as you're going through, once you start a particular condition and certain things happen, you can then go to the next condition and so on. And you can again bring these actions in to then define what happens for a particular condition when it's met or when it's not met. When you look at when you want to deal with views are again a way of presenting lists of information. Normally, you want to create filters to make sure that this is driven to what is going to be displayed on a given view. Now, all of the normal security applies to a view based on how you have your security roles set up and how you have your data visibility set up as well. And then, in addition to that, you can also create a particular type of information to be displayed when you create a view. As it says here, it's very similar to the SQL where clause. Everything that we do within the view for the query is stored as fetch XML. If you're not familiar with fetch XML, there's a link to our developer information that I'll provide at the end of this presentation that talks about that, and you can actually go and look at that. You have the ability when you create the view for the conditional criteria. For example, if you're creating a view that says, on the form of where you're displaying the view, show me, for example, my open opportunities. So when you create the view itself, you would bring up the opportunity entity, and then you would define user equals or owner equals current user. And then when you put that view into a view that's accessible by that user, whatever a particular user accesses, it's only going to be referenced to that user, not any user that happens to bring the form up. It will be specific to each user, and not provide any other information. Or, for example, maybe you want to see data that represents something that's changed, been updated or modified on is the field that we would reference in the last 3 months. We do have things in those conditions within the view creation that allow you to use that as a shortcut instead of having to define a date range specifically and try to drive that yourself. So we have that ability to be dynamic so that the view is always relevant and the view is always active, and you're not having to go in and change the view every time something related to that particular dynamic condition. So some users use to display, to directly display records, and others may be kind of the starting point for looking at other information or tying to a chart, potentially within a dashboard. Sometimes you may display a list view of certain information and a chart that gives a different representation of the same information. And then, of course, there's a number of other features that you can do with that. On the columns that can be displayed within the view, you just define those columns just like you would. They're all ones that are related within the primary entity, or even potentially in a related entity. You can also display that information as well. And then you can predefine a sort by identifying up the 2 columns that kind of drive the sorting of what's displayed in the entity from the main entity itself. Custom views. So you have the ability to go in. Of course, we have a lot of views that come with all of our entities that come out of the box, but you also have the ability to create custom views as well. And when you create these views, you can just take a current existing view and then do a save as and create a new view. So, for example, my open opportunities, as an example. Maybe I want to see my open opportunities that I haven't touched in the last 7 days. I can go in and bring up the My Open Opportunities view, do a save as, and then change the criteria on that view from just the ones where I am the owner, current user, for example, me as the user, current owner, to I am the owner, and the modified on hasn't been, it's older than 7 days. And then that way you can actually see a list of opportunities that you haven't interacted with in the last week, as an example. A little bit different than modifying system views, but certainly, this is something where you have the ability to create views that are system-wide versus user views that are specific to a user, because we do provide the capability for users to create their own views. And then they can actually, when they go to, for example, if they were to go to accounts, the default system view for them would be My Active Accounts. They can actually create their own version of My Active Accounts, make whatever changes they want, and then make that their default view. That's stored as a user view, and that, it doesn't change the system view, but it allows them to add some customization. So it gives them a little bit of empowerment on accessing information. So when you look at system versus personal charts and views, so system views are created by your system admin or your system customizer. They can be included as part of the solution. They can also be included in the system or personal dashboards. They're available to all users. And of course, they can be exported as a chart XML file or imported from a chart XML file. For personal views, they're created by an individual user. They're not included in a solution. They can be included in personal, but not system dashboards. So users do have the ability to create their own dashboards, and within their own dashboards, they can put their own views. Very handy if each person likes to work a little bit differently. This gives them a bit more control over their environment, and it gives them the feeling that they actually have some control over how they want to see information to make them more productive. They do have the ability, when they create these views and dashboards, to share them with other users or teams. And they can be exported as chart XML, or they can be imported from a chart XML. So to kind of give you a sense of what we're talking about here is a sales management dashboard that basically kind of displays open opportunities. It displays actual revenue by month, opportunities by close probability, per individual representative. Maybe this is more of a management view. And then, of course, the top open opportunities. As you can see here, there's a lot of flexibility in how that information is displayed. And then you have the ability to kind of control this. And then, of course, these views can also be oriented towards individual users and you can represent this for an individual user or each rep versus just this management view where it's a little bit broader in scope. Extensions. So we've talked a bit about customizations, but I want to just to kind of summarize here. We do look at development within the Dynamics world in a couple of different ways. So customizations is one way where everything is pretty much done within the tool, building forms, creating entities, creating attributes for those entities, creating relationships. All of those things are done within the platform, within the tool itself. And that gives you the ability to do that type of what we call configuration within the tool. Now, we're going to talk a little bit now about extensions and how you can extend functionality within the platform and the mechanisms that you can use to do that. So one of the things that has changed with our V9 release is that there is no longer a specific SDK package or that gets released as a single file that you then download and unzip and put within your Visual Studio apparatus to do development. You can pretty much now download everything from NuGet. You can actually find sample code as well in the code directory. And again, I'll give you the link at the end of this discussion today to our developer site that we call the Developer's Guide, but it is actually now kind of a visual representation of the SDK. So as you can see here, one of the things that we talk about extensibility and what can be modified and how it can be modified. There are several different ways in which you can extend functionality within Dynamics 365. So, for example, on the server itself, kind of encapsulated within your instance, you can create what we call plugins. And plugins are represented as .NET code, typically built in C#, where you can actually put a plugin interactively into a process. Something very simple, for example, when I'm entering information on a form, I want to make sure that if I'm entering a phone number for a particular person, that phone number is not on a do not call list, as an example. So I can create a plugin that when I enter in the phone number, I can actually go out and check whatever I have as a do not call list for that phone number, and then determine how I want to handle that phone number and maybe provide some additional information back. That could be done as a plugin, which could be interacted and invoked on the form. But it can also be interacted. It can also be invoked in a batch mode, for example. If you're running a workflow and the same type of thing happens, that plugin can still be invoked as well. So there's a number of different ways that the functionality of the system can be extended. If, for example, the out-of-the-box functionality doesn't specifically meet your needs, we do provide you these mechanisms. We provide pretty much now all functionality via a REST API, what we call our web API. I talked about the plugins already. You do have the ability to create separate applications that can interact with CRM. You can also create custom reporting. You can go in and within the system itself, you can create workflows or business process flows that are represented as processes. And of course, you can create rules that are represented as business rules or that are based on field values. In terms of what we provide to developers to be able to be more effective, we provide a lot of information within our doc site. When you are going to actually develop, there may be things that you need to know, for example, like endpoints and specific ways to connect with your Dynamics instance, and that's where this information is stored. So if you go to your Dynamics instance and you go to settings and you go to customization, you will see under the customization menu a developer resources section, and this is what you'll see there. So if, for example, you're looking for the name of your endpoint to interact with the web API, you will see that as well as how you can potentially connect your apps to the Dynamics 365 Discovery Service. So maybe you're building an app that you don't necessarily want them to enter the specific URL, but you want them to enter their user ID and then behind the scenes make the determination of what URL to use. You could use the Discovery Service. That's one way to do that. If you want to connect with the Azure Service Bus listener that's associated with that particular Dynamics instance, we provide you that endpoint as well. So this is where you'll find a lot of that particular information. In terms of web services, what we offer, so one of the things that we offer is with the Web API is the ability to interact with the instance. Pretty much all of the functionality that was within our old SOAP endpoint exists within the Web API. We have deprecated the SOAP functionality, so there won't be any improvements or enhancements to the SOAP functionality. It is still supported, and you can still use the SOAP endpoint, but we are recommending that everyone begin to start using our Web API and interacting with the system in that way. So when you connect to Dynamics using the Web API, what do? Well, this follows the very standard web development and web service development model. So you will authenticate with OAuth. We do support the ability to leverage MFA through that process. All of that comes in through Azure AD, and then depending on how your authentication is set up for your particular Dynamics tenant, that you may be federated, which is where it's driven through ADFS or some other identity provider and goes back to your system to then do the actual authentication. Or it could be that using DirSync or some other mechanism. But the idea is that when you go to authenticate against a Dynamics instance, it's always going to talk to Azure AD, and then Azure AD may be talking to something else in the back end. It will provide a valid token, and then the user goes forward. One of the questions that we get a lot, and I'll just sidetrack here for 1 second, one of the questions that we get a lot related to this is, well, what is my authentication option within Dynamics? Well, there isn't one. All authentication coming into the tenant is controlled by Azure AD. So it's the same authentication that is used for Office 365 services within that same tenant, as well as any other services that are associated with that tenant. And it's all controlled by both potentially Azure AD as well as your on-premise AD if you have that relationship set up. If you are doing web development, if you're doing HTTP and a very simple web development, we do recommend that you use the Azure authentication library, the ADAL library. It's very powerful, and it offers a lot of flexibility and functionality in terms of how you do authentication. And that's if you use those calls that are provided in that library, it simplifies the authentication process for you. If you do want to create a custom application to access Dynamics through this process, it's called a model called a single-page application model, and there's documentation within the Azure documentation line that talks about how to use what we call the SPA model for authenticating and interacting with Dynamics 365. Here's a simple walkthrough of registering an SPA application. So you would actually go within Azure AD, you would register your SPA application. You would then define the interaction and the entity that you want to interact with, and then it displays a very simple screen. This is actually sample code, and the link is here. This link will be available to you, of course, as part of the presentation after today. But this actually walks you through the whole process of doing this, setting up your app, and then actually interacting with a Dynamics instance. So I mentioned plugins previously. So what are plugins? Plugins, again, are a way to extend the Dynamics functionality on the server side of the interaction. So when you're interacting from wherever you are, your PC, you're on the client side. But if you want the behavior to basically be there for all users across a particular entity or a number of entities, or you want to extend and change or modify functionality, plugins are the way to do that. It's basically code that you create that is brought across as a .NET assembly, and then you can create how that .NET assembly interacts with the system, depending on what triggers it and what drives it to interact and what it does. Now, the code within it is actually the functionality that it does, but you then also have to go in for that plugin and create how that plugin goes and interacts with the system once it's invoked. So to understand this, what does that really mean, and how is that invocation really driven? Let's talk a little bit about our event execution pipeline. So what this does is this says, okay, there are a number of stages that events go through within the Dynamics platform, and I want to be able to interact at a certain point. Now, just so that you understand, where you look here, you have a couple of different options. You can basically do pre-operation, main operation, or post-operation. And what that means is, what this basically means is, for example, for pre-validation, maybe there's something that you want to do to delete some information, or potentially you want to do something before a create form is invoked. You may want to make sure that you want to do things. For example, once the security validation is done on a given form, you want to make sure that you want to do something to information before the data is written back as a commit to the database. So on an update, for example, you want to check to make sure information is there before that record is actually written. Maybe you want to remind the user, hey, no, you need to enter these pieces of information as well. And then, of course, on a post-operation, it's triggered after security validation and then still within the database, but after the commit is fired. So, for example, I go in and I create an opportunity. And now I want to go and create a reminder for myself or a follow-up appointment with an individual based on the creation of that opportunity. Once that opportunity has been created and the commit is fired, then you can go in and say, make my plugin go and create a new appointment for me to follow up with this individual after it has been created. So how do you create plugins? As I mentioned before, plugins are C# code, and we provide a lot of out-of-the-box assemblies to allow you to then leverage and create plugins to do the things that you need to do. Use Visual Studio for that, and then you also want to make sure that you do include all of the assemblies that provide all of the code, the core code that allows you to do that direction. And then, of course, you want to make sure that you are creating it in a way that is valid. If you use our templates and you do those things, once you've created the assembly, you then can actually use what we call the plugin registration tool. You go in and actually register the assembly and then define the plugins that are within it and how they behave. So this is where you would drive the behavior. So this is where, for example, within this assembly, there's a plugin. You talk about that plugin and how it's actually going to behave on what entity and how it's invoked. This is critical to understand because as you create plugins, if you don't really understand this, you can create a plugin that fires needlessly for a lot of different actions. You have to be very careful to make sure you're firing on the right message for the right entity, and then that way that plugin will only invoke when you want it to. And it's a good performance best practice just to make sure that you're aware of that. And then that way, just make sure, before I leave this topic, I'm going to go back here 1 second. The other thing here with plugins is to make sure that when you're building functionality for plugins, there's always the tendency, because you're writing code, to put a whole lot of things within one plugin. I would tell you from a best practice perspective that plugins function best when they are very atomic in functionality. Do not make them complicated. Do not try to add a lot of layered functionality in there, because, of course, that always has an impact on your user experience. So if you keep those plugins fairly simple and focused in scope, and then, of course, make sure when you register them that you register them appropriately, you will get the most optimal user experience out of that. So now, in terms of controlling functionality and extending functionality on the server side, the plugins are primarily the way to do that. On the client side, you would do this through what we call client-side scripting. This is all basically done with JavaScript. We do provide some capabilities to help you do client-side scripting if it's necessary. Something that you want to make sure that when you're looking at this type of functionality, that you are thinking about what types of things make more sense to happen on the client versus happening on the server side. For example, customers who have very strict rules about what comes in and out of their environment, Sometimes maybe accessing a system within your own environment is better done from the client side than it is from the server side, where we would do what we call a callback plugin that can actually call back into your environment. So just something to consider when you're looking at server side versus client side extension, what makes more sense. But we do provide a lot of capabilities to do this. And like I said before, it does allow you to kind of think about what makes sense to be done on the server side versus what can be done on the client side. We do support it on basically on all platforms. We support it on the browser. We support it on tablets. We support it on phones. We also support the API if you're going to do this what we call offline access. This is something that this can still be invoked, and your forms will function the way that you would expect them to function. Looking at events, so when you look at events in terms of how you are managing things on the client side, there are a number of different events that get fired as part of the form control, and basically you have the ability to interact with those events and do things on the client side, just like you do. We were talking a little bit about on the server side, how you interact with those within the event pipeline. So when you look at this from a client perspective, there are a lot of different events here that you can interact with, depending on whether you're on a form or whether you're within a field, whether or not you're dealing with a particular tab or an iframe. We also provide functionality to interact with both grids and subgrids. So you do have some customization capability on the client side when they're interacting with a subgrid. Maybe you want a certain type of behavior to happen when they invoke a record off of a subgrid. You can control how that behavior happens, and maybe there's some pre-processing or post-processing that you want to take place there that you don't want to put on the server side. And then, of course, same thing in interacting with both workflows and business processes, and then, of course, on the lookup as well. So, for example, if there's something that you're doing on a particular lookup where maybe you pre-pinned information and it's actually stored, but the user's not aware of that, you can intercept that with the pre-search and do make that quick addition that it needs to before it actually goes and does the search, so that it's pulling back the relevant information that you want it to display. As I mentioned here, there's a lot of information within this, and some of the links at the end of the discussion will point you to information to begin to give you a lot more detail about how all of this works, but certainly just to give you a good sense of how this behavior works. You have the ability to really do a lot of extension on the client side as well by interacting with these types of events. So what is the client API object model? So the client API object model basically allows you to, this is what provides the objects and methods that you can interact with, taking advantage of the event, as well as, understanding how you can then create this extension on the client side. You do have the ability to get the execution context, so where you are on a form or a grid and what you're doing. The form context gives you control or access to a lot of the controls on the form. It gives you the ability to interact with those controls, whether it's, checking the value that's in a particular field or, or maybe making something visible or not visible, or making it enabled or disabled. Those types of things you have the ability to do through the form context. Within the grid context, you have the ability to interact with a grid or a subgrid on a form and control specific actions on the grid. And then finally, what we call the XRM context. This is the global object that encapsulates all of these other these other objects, that would then allow you to interact more broadly with the system, things that basically don't necessarily just control the data or forms or grids or subgrids, but there are some other things that you can do, other information that you can get to within the broader context outside of each of these individual contexts. So when we consider all these things and we really want to understand where we're going with this and what we're doing, what are good best practices to follow? This is, of course, not a completely comprehensive list, but certainly we want to try and point out the things that we've seen tend to cause users the most grief in the implementations that we've worked from a fast track perspective. These are things that as you're going through and you're doing your configuration and your customization, your development, if you will, to kind of keep an eye on. So one thing that's important is when you create option sets, you really do not want to include an option set in a quick find. And the reason for this is because it helps to control the performance of a quick find. It creates if you will, kind of a number of additional potential options that could be done. So it kind of expands the amount of data. You really don't want to do that. You want to keep your quick finds very simple and very focused. In terms of kind of general performance, when you are creating queries and you're leveraging these queries either in code or in JavaScript, you want to make sure that you are dealing with a column set. A lot of times especially we see this a lot of times people developing plugins, when they're creating a query as part of a plugin or as part of a custom action, they do not include specific fields in the column set. They just allow it to pull all fields back, which is very inefficient. So when you're using a column set, you want to make sure that you are only bringing back the pieces of information that are actually critical to what you're doing in that moment. You also want to make sure that while it's not necessarily necessary anymore, you should always specify no lock just to be safe. And then, of course, lastly, you want to make sure that as you are pulling information back, that you are aware if there are what we call multiple pages. So when you get a lot of records back, as you can see here in the model that's presented, we're going through, there's a more records indicator within the collection. And basically what we're doing is we're checking the collection to see if there's more records. We paginate this to make the management of those records easier, especially in extremely large record sets. So you want to make sure that you're aware of that when you're interacting with those, that you're managing that pagination correctly. Don't just look at the first page that's returned. That may or may not be everything that you need. You may have to go through more of the pages, and then you just want to make sure that you're doing that as efficiently as possible, and you're using that information to help you manage how you perform with your data. So another thing from a performance perspective, you want to make sure that when you are interacting with the system, that you batch your request into a single web service call. For example, this is what we call our execute multiple. You want to make sure that you are, for example, if you're creating records, instead of creating records one at a time, we are calling what we call a create request, that you actually create a batch of these requests within an execute multiple request. This puts the processing off of you and puts it over onto the server. So you can put up to 1,000 records in a single execute multiple request, and then that goes over to us, and then we will begin to process those 1,000 requests. And then you have options when you create the execute multiple on how you want responses back, whether you want it to continue even if an error occurs, and how you want to handle the information that comes back from the execute multiple. We talk about network latency. So, for example, if you're running this within your environment, within your corporate network, and you're interacting with the Dynamics instance, if you find that there's a bit of latency between that, within that interaction, you may want to use the batch request instead of doing individual create calls. But, ultimately, you have to kind of look at these things and decide what's the best path for you. We don't necessarily recommend that you from an on-prem perspective, where you're not going to have a lot of latency, you really don't need execute multiple. You have a bit more control over how those requests are managed and how many requests you can hit the server with at any given time, because of course you have all of that within your network infrastructure. So from a service perspective, we do have some things that we do to kind of keep things balanced and keep available load and capacity for all users using the service. So this is a very effective way of doing, like, for example, data import or ongoing data migration as an example, as well as potentially if you need to go through and make a lot of modifications to a particular entity or data set, this is another way that you can do that very effectively. When you're executing a plugin, You want to make sure that if you are calling web services that you disable keep alive. Uh, just from a performance perspective, you want to make sure that connection is not being kept alive if something's happening on the other side. You want that timeout to invoke. You want it to fire. You want to make sure that, because if that connection, something happens with that connection, you're not getting a response, you don't want that hanging. You also don't want to make sure that it's trying to use expired sessions. So these are all things that you need to keep an eye out for. When a particular plugin is executed, it is cached. The object is not disposed. So you do want to make sure that you're aware of that. You want to make sure don't use global variables. There is no thread safety. You have to be very careful in terms of how you deal with it. You want that to be atomic, so you do not want to do something again. As I said, you want your plugins to be simple. So would not go and create multi-thread interactions within a single plugin, because we're not guaranteed, your thread safety is not guaranteed there. So you want to keep it isolated to that user, and then with that execution and user execution context, you are safe. But you don't want to go very complicated and start to try to create these multi-thread plugins. It's not advised. You want to make sure that when you're building your plugins, that you are leveraging static variables, just because it performs more efficiently, and you want to make sure that you do these things to kind of keep the behaviors clean and as performant as possible. As I mentioned before, you want to make sure that you want to avoid unnecessary plugin execution. So when you go through and you're registering your plugin, you want to understand how that plugin is registered and make sure that it is only registered for the specific MD, maybe even down to the field level, for the specific context in which you want it to fire. That will make your system much more performant, and it will actually allow you to keep your execution much cleaner and avoid things happening that may not be readily explainable without doing a little bit of deeper research and investigation. So, if, for example, when you're working with your plugins, when you're working with these things, you want to make sure that you are handling exceptions effectively, that you're capturing them on your own side, and that you are handling exceptions that come back from system calls. You want to make sure that you're using, for example, the invalid plugin execution exception class. This way, it reports effectively and cleanly. It gives you the ability to see that through the plugin tracing functionality within the platform. Use the eye tracing service as well as the plugin profiler. This will give you more better understanding of plugin execution and what's happening, as well as being able to again see what happens within the service and how that information is captured on errors. And then lastly, from an exception handling perspective, don't catch generic exceptions, and then make sure that you are dealing with your catch blocks appropriately. On the client side, when you're invoking JavaScript, avoid invoking synchronous calls. Do everything that you can asynchronously, and make sure that you're managing that. Effectively, because that then again prevents unseen delays in your user experience. It's just a cleaner way of creating client-side extension functionality that you want to take advantage of. On the forms themselves within the platform, when you initially open a form, you may have a lot of tabs of information. We recommend that you collapse those, and then that way you only open them when you need them. That helps optimize your form performance, as it doesn't have to worry about it. It kind of loads it in the background and kind of prepares the rendering in the background so that you don't have to worry about it. It brings up the information that needs to be seen right away as quickly as possible. We don't recommend redirection within forms. We want to make sure that you don't try to make a form invoke itself, for example, or have a form invoke another form within itself. We also want to make sure that you don't have multiple quick view forms on a given form, as that can have a significant impact on performance. JavaScript itself, we do not support end user manipulation of the DOM directly. The primary reason for this is because we've provided a lot of context information and objects for you to interact with the form. If you go directly into the DOM, They make modifications. Those are things that may change underneath you in the future. It's not upgradable, so that's why it's not supported. And then, of course, there are some other types of JavaScript coding that are unsupported. And then we provide a custom code validation tool that can help you in identifying some of those unsupported actions within the code. So as I mentioned at the beginning, here's some resources that are available to you. We do no longer distribute the quote-unquote SDK as a distributable file. We now provide everything via our doc site. So the top link there in the resources is the actual doc site itself. It's kind of the top-level doc site for Dynamics 365. You could actually just go to docs.microsoft.com, and you'll see docs for all of our products. It's a very useful site. I use it a lot myself. But for Dynamics, you can actually go to Dynamics 365, and there is, again, additional information there. If you go under Integrate, Customize, and Develop, you will see sections for customer engagement as well as finance and operations. Under the customer engagement section, you will see that there's a link for the overview. I would recommend you start there. There's a lot of information there on customization. Follow the links, drill down into them, and make sure that you spend some time kind of understanding the flow of information as it exists there. You'll find that a very helpful tool as you go forward. And then lastly, of course, for developers, for doing extensions, you can go to the actual developer guide for customer engagement, which is a page now within our doc site that contains a lot of great links to information. It contains links to sample code, a lot of information on how to use NuGet, as we were talking about, for doing Visual Studio development with plugins. And certainly, those are the types of information that you will find extremely helpful. So in terms of my presentation itself, that is it. I have already seen some questions come up, so we can start going through and I'll just answer them. So question on RCSI. So you don't have to worry about RCSI getting set. That's done by default now. It's not something that you have to worry about from an online perspective. That really only matters if you're on-prem. You want to make sure that your database on-prem has RCSI set, or know that setting if you're interacting with it programmatically. So you just need to make sure when you interact with your DBAs that you find out whether RCSI is set on-premise. Online, it doesn't matter anymore. It's all taken care of behind the scenes. You don't have to worry about it. Will the presentation be made available for download? Absolutely. I believe so. Janice can probably tell us, give us maybe an approximate time frame. I'm not sure exactly when that will be, but I don't know, Janice, it would be available just via view, or will they be able to download the deck as well?
We'll make it available during download for the on-demand recording, and they'll find the location in a follow-up email.
Fantastic. Thank you. And then is the custom code validation tool something we could use in unit testing? It's not really a unit testing. You could, but it's really kind of designed to look more broadly at your JavaScript. You could use it piece by piece like that, but it's probably better to just, because it evaluates your entire solution. So it's probably better to just let it run once you've kind of got your solution done before you're ready to then, propagate it maybe as the last step. I would say that it's not a unit testing tool. It's more of once my developers have done their basic unit testing, then we'll run the validation tool to make sure that there's something that's not there. The other thing, too, I'll tell you, as you become familiar with best practices, this isn't something that you need to run very often. This really does tell you more, are you following best practices, or is there any unsupported code? If you're controlling your own environment, then you should be okay. Almost all of our ISVs that create custom code do all of this before they ever publish a solution. If you do have concerns, it's something you could, you ask them, have you guys run this? Do you have any unsupported JavaScript within your solution? But typically, our ISVs are really good about not doing that. So not something that you typically have to worry about. Normally, this is something that maybe you have an old system, maybe a version 3 or version 4 system, and you're migrating, and you want to know, okay, I did a lot of these things. They were supported and weren't specifically covered one way or the other in version 3 or version 4 or even 2011. I want to make sure that as I'm moving forward, I'm no longer doing those things that I should be doing. That's really where that custom code validation tool comes into play. Any other questions?
That's all we have in the queue right now. So, ladies and gentlemen, if you'd like to ask any more questions, go ahead and type your question into the white text box and send it on in, and Chris will answer it. In the meantime, I'd like to take a moment here and bring your attention to a link that I posted in the messages panel. That's a link to a short survey for this web conference. We ask that you please take a moment before logging out to access it. We hope that you found today's information helpful, and if you enjoyed today's web conference, have feedback on how we can provide you a better event, or you would like to submit topics for future web conferences, this is your chance to let us know. The survey scores are on a scale from 1 to 5, with 5 being the highest score possible. I'm going to go ahead and give just a couple more moments to see if any questions come in. Chris, are there any final thoughts before we wrap up?
Yeah, actually. So I do want to say to everyone on the call, thank you very much for attending today. I really appreciate your time. And we absolutely would like your feedback, because we want to know if what we're doing has value for you, if this information is valuable, if these types of presentations of our Tech Talks from a fast track program perspective are valuable to you. So please let us know that. Please make sure to go through and answer the questions in the survey. I certainly appreciate your feedback as well. And I know that as you go through this process, there's a lot of information that we've covered today. Please make sure and follow the documentation links and go and really spend time. I think you'll find it very valuable, and it's certainly pretty much any question that you can think of is out there, and the information for it is out there as well. So happy coding and good luck, and thank you all very much if there are no further questions.
All right, thank you, Chris. We do not have any further questions. So, ladies and gentlemen, that is going to conclude today's web conference. Attendees can access the web conference recording at the same registration site within 24 hours. I'd like to extend a big thank you to our presenter, Chris, and thank you, audience, for logging in and joining us today.